I guess I'll just like kind of think about some of the core sort of the ethic of the some of these things that you mentioned right at the beginning. Scholars, creative practitioners, and generally thinkers of the field have been on a path to move away from theorizing the global South from a North Atlantic vantage point for the last decade. And I just wanted to like, I'll just think through a few of those things a little bit quickly before, so giving people time to ask their questions also. So your sort of major formulation of the world system photography also came out in the early period of this time of necessary change, a time that has also led to so many new exciting methodological and theoretical explorations overall, deeply affecting, reshaping, and overhauling certain aspects of the entire disciplines towards a more progressive future of material and historical analysis, and not just setting records straight for the global South only. In this talk you did, and as I believe we all should, be it as academics or general citizens, challenge narratives of imposed localization that turn certain anecdotes into certain narratives into subplots, or certain communities into footnotes, and focus on regional social political arcs, as you do in your illustrated example. Sort of pushing the transnational networks of ideas, technologies, and capital to be an integrated and uniform global encounter can also be a North Atlantic trope where they facilitate and determine the nature of the exchange. And in this particular thing, you're also moving away from the vernacular to the demotic in a way that leaves behind the politics of classification employed by the state towards the agency of communities. I wanted to think a bit more about, like to start off, I wanted to think a bit more about the site or the field of this research, sort of the networked urban media and modernities play out in the somewhat indeterminate and complex post-colonial cities and towns, and sometimes unscripted neighborhoods within those cities and towns that have taken on a life of their own. In the contemporary context as well, legal technological infrastructures around media, technology, even electricity are often imaginatively bypassed, creating a further layer of media density that is simply too vast and diverse to be understood to be by any one form of analysis, and renders obviously any exhaustive claims impossible. So I was wondering, like, because traditional urban sociology or sociology of any form of like technological form and modernity focuses on size and density and big things, and leading always to the kinds of sort of urbanities unfolding in large or mega cities a lot of the time. But would you like to talk a bit about the small and medium towns and villages, which are often quite ad hoc, haphazard, as a site of media and modernity, which are your favored sites often, where recycled, neglected, trashed media and media practices, residual media, really thrive, like your typewriter, and how these places outside of the big metros or in the little pockets of the metros have been helping us learn a lot about what we know about image practices, but also generally media, culture, and society. Sort of by what we could learn from this sort of places by focusing on energies on like small towns and rural sites.
Yeah, thanks for that, Sendrati. Well, it's perhaps useful to start by saying that I went to this particular part of Malwa in pursuit of a site for my PhD research. And I wanted to find a very large-scale continuous production industrial setup, which I did in this particular location, then ended up living mostly in a village about 6 kilometers away from the factory. So it's, you know, it's on the one hand rural, Moffasil, small town. I mean, the town's grown much bigger since. but I was attracted there in the first place because of the kind of radical collapse within this single space of the rural, the urban, the artisanal, the industrial, the bucolic, the apocalyptic. You know, in that sense, it was always a kind of ready-made Kali Yugi landscape of Kali Yugi in the more by virtue of Kali Yuga, the yuga of machinery. So I think it's always, I was attracted by its very hybridity, and I think that still remains a large part of its the reason for its productivity in thinking about these questions that you raise about the collapse of scales, the intersection of different media. So I'm not, I'm kind of trying to resist saying that I think this is somehow a different space from other spaces anywhere, let alone, you know, metropolitan Indian spaces. The typewriter was in Nai Sarak, you know, which is hardly off the beaten track. Yeah, so I think I would want to resist the idea that somehow this work is coming out of a peculiarly marginalized rural space. I think it's coming out of a space which is probably pretty, you know, widely dispersed throughout India and the world, which is a space where these different life worlds, technologies, attitudes, practices, all continually intersect. One thing perhaps to add is that, you know, and this perhaps may appear to slightly contradict what I just tried to articulate, is that when I first went to Malwa in 1982, anthropologically speaking, I was in wanting to work on industrial labor. That was quite an unusual thing to do within South Asian anthropology at the time. But paradoxically, now I become so attached to this particular village in which I first did my fieldwork in 82, 83. I find myself doing again something that's rather out of rhythm with the times. So I think rural ethnography, rural living, has very little space in the contemporary anthropological imagination of contemporary South Asia. So I feel that this 40 years journey has kind of taken me to a position that's very different from the one I started in.
I think someone has joined us here, Subhashri Rath. If you wanted to ask your question directly yourself, Subhashri.
Yes, hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah.
Okay, so first of all, I'm extremely grateful for this talk. Thank you, ASAP Art and Christopher. So my question is, photography and anthropology are both known to be handmaidens of colonialism. How does your work and research navigate this knowledge in relation to power and notions of the other? Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question. Yeah, I mean, I think my previous answer, in a way, the structure of it could almost be applied to this, and in that I want to make reference to how my thinking and my position has rather changed over the course of 40 years. So I think if we were speaking in the 1990s, I'd probably very fervently want to agree with you on anthropology and photography as the handmaiden of colonialism. Now my position is rather different, and I think that it would be something like this, that anthropology and photography certainly aspired to serve as the handmaiden of colonialism. The anthropologists and photographers were endlessly trying to suggest that their practices could be of use to the colonial presence. But in trying to demonstrate that, my feeling is they were largely thwarted. And so I become much more interested in what I think of as the trouble with photography. This, I think, then connects with what I called earlier via, taking that phrase from Roland Barthes, an ontological desire. So I think, to my mind, what makes photography interesting and different to other visual media is the ineradicability of the event, the mise en scène, the pro-filmic. In that respect, it's different from other representational technologies. So what I've increasingly become aware of is the difficulties that photographers and those that commission photographs have in getting the photographs they want or the photographs they imagine. And so I think this was, a very clear problem, a difficulty in the official use of photography by colonial regimes. This is a theme, a very strong theme in a book I did called Photography and Anthropology, I think published in 2011, which Senjuti correctly observed in her introduction, argues for the parallel histories of anthropology and photography, but also argues that photography very often proved itself not to be useful to anthropology and not to be useful to colonialism, because the image is not simply an ideological transcription. The photographer may have an idea of the image they want to acquire prior to making the image, but the practical obstacles of the event, the pro-filmic, etc., generally produced images ruffled by unruliness and contingency that made them unsuitable for the ideological purposes to which they'd been imagined. So I think my position has pretty much changed on this. And I think that reflects more encounters with photography, more time spent in studios, more time spent looking at people's WhatsApp messages, more time spent in archives. I think it's taught me to see, or to treat the photographic evidence, the evidence of the images, as different. And just to wrap up, I mean, I think that image that I was discussing, which I wanted to argue was a Meterian image of the guy about to sacrifice the 2 goats. I think that's an unruly, contingent image that has its own narrative. And so I suppose I've become increasingly skeptical of master templates that can be applied to vast trawls, tranches of material. I think if one works from the bottom up, scrutinizing images as closely as possible, gathering as much information about individual images as one can from the bottom up, there then comes a point at which that perspective clashes with these top-down grand assumptions with which I once definitely agreed about anthropology and photography serving as the handmaiden of colonialism. So you might want to come back on that rather unsatisfactory answer.
Thank
I
you.
think we can,
That
okay, of
actually, sorry, just a quick comment. That actually
course.
sort of makes me think more and not necessarily stop on the face value of the assumption like you mentioned. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for the question.
I think there's someone else, Alex Fraser Rose, who's in the chat with in the Zoom with us right now. If you wanted to ask your question, Alex, I think I've also seen your question on the chat. So if you wanted to ask it. Hello, Alex, are you there? Okay, maybe I'll okay. So maybe I will sort of combine Alex's question and a question that just came in, and this might sort of evoke some moments from the, I don't know, 80s, early 80s or so, which might be fun, which is why did you get interested in Indian visual culture? And the other thing is from, this is from Alex. And the other one is from Sahib Singh, who's a PhD student at UCL in anthropology, currently doing fieldwork in rural central India. The question is, how did you initially decide to study industrial life in rural India? So what was the genesis of your doctoral project? And when did your interest in visual culture take off? Was it a part of a postdoctoral project, or like, I guess they mean like, was it a part of generally your institution, the PhD you had started? And did the seed of this interest take place during your doctoral fieldwork? My internet isn't very good, so can't really get on and ask. So I feel like both these questions are kind of curious about the beginnings of your research in India and like what led you to look this way. And so if you wanted to take that.
Yeah, they're rather parallel questions, as you say. Well, the origin of the interest in industrial labour came out of my political commitments. I'd also read E.P. Thompson's famous article on time, work, discipline, and the rise of capitalism. So I think I thought there was a kind of ethical and psychological watershed in establishing capitalism that could be clarified by examining, you know, through field work, the transition of ex-rural laborers into the dark satanic mills of viscose rayon production. So this was the factory I eventually focused my work on and lived near to. Was a large Grasim plant employing at that time about 25,000 people in a continuous production system. It had a very loud factory whistle that could be heard up to about 8 miles distant. So it was a very dominant presence, a very polluting presence as well, I should say, at the time. That's abated to quite an extent recently. So I think it was it attracted me as a incredibly alluring living actualization of the problem that E.P. Thompson had expressed so brilliantly, which is, you know, what happens when your idyllic rural lifestyle is ruptured by the appearance of this dangerously polluting, noisy, you know, blood demanding, time demanding, labor extracting presence. I mean, as a footnote, as it turned out, it almost made more sense to invert E.P. Thompson in this context, so that if you're working in agriculture, you generally work much longer hours for massively less pay. You were subject to more coercion, especially if you were a bonded labourer. And so the rural workforce, rather than fearing industrial work, was desperately trying to get into the factory because it paid massively more. You were expected to work much less. There were all these different categories of leave. if you were really lucky, you might get a job working in the cafeteria rather than on the production line. So the reality turned out to be rather surprising. And then how did the visual emerge out of this? Well, I did have a pre-existing interest in the visual, but I found myself spending a lot of time sitting in workers' village houses, staring up at the calendars and chromolithographs that they had hanging on their walls, and also in some cases at framed photographs. And it became clear to me that I found these much more interesting than work rotas and trying to compile absentee records. So one of the great debates in Indian industrial anthropology and sociology concerns absentee rates. And I was initially very enthusiastically collating data on this, but in the end abandoned it so I could spend more time feasting my eyes on so-called calendar art. So I was converted by the process of fieldwork, by the experience of being there, being in that particular environment, and especially by what I saw in the domestic environment of workers. And that then led to my, well, yes, I would say to a visual addiction to that genre, that set of aesthetics of calendar art. So I just had to keep finding more and more of it. And that then led to the work which was mostly published as Photos of the Gods, which is on commercial print culture. So of course, Photos of the Gods, Bhagwan ki photo, being very semiotically anomalous there, so that these printed images are also called photos. So there's a debate to be had there about local semiotics versus universal semiotics that we could perhaps have on another occasion. So I mean, that's perhaps provides the bare bones of what happened. I see there's a question in Q&A from Sumati as well.
Oh, I don't seem to see this one.
Shall I read it out?
Yeah.
Hi, this is Sumati logging in from Chennai. I wonder if I can push you to think about the status of Photoshop in the photo state. As you know, Photoshop is a proprietary digital software, but now the term exceeds its origins in diverse ways, including its capacity to intervene in the camera's original work and bend the camera's work to one's own will, if you will. I'm especially curious to know what your Dalit informants understand about Photoshop. Yeah, great question. Thank you, Sumati. I mean, I think this is also a question about the digital in general versus the analog. And I think about that, I'd say that, you know, whilst I mean, one of the things I hope my account does is provide a sense of photography as continually evolving. So, you know, my very profound assumption is that we still don't know what photography is yet. So that any account of photography has to respect its fluidity, its mobility, its you know, transformational slipperiness, and that was very much a theme in the coming of photography in India. So on the one hand, I think that's very important. So I don't at all seek to downplay the importance of the digital as against the analog. However, I think that there are still many traces and residues of the event of the analog event within the digital. I mean, there's great work on the endurance of the index in photons transmitted from Mars rover to the, you know, NASA cameras by Jan Seppänen. So I think the idea that there's a dramatic and fundamental break between analog and digital in terms of the abolition of the event, the abolition of the index, and so on, I think that's unfounded. And I think that, well, one only has to think of what the Indian press delights in calling Photoshop fails. I mean, for instance, you know, Modi, to take a Chennai example, Modi's seated in an airplane looking out through a strange porthole at flood relief efforts in Chennai of a few years ago, famously doctored image. One can see the image there disabled, undone by what one might think of as analog grit. So two different events were combined with Photoshop, supposedly to produce a superior image, but it was done so cack-handedly that it in fact unraveled the image, and I think that's reassuringly common. So in this Central Indian context, Photoshop is, I mean, the actual Adobe Photoshop, pirated Adobe Photoshop program is the most commonly used one. But I think it builds upon artisanal techniques, some of which are described in Camera Indica, so hand-created montages on wedding albums, but also pre-Photoshop digital templates. So there's a long history here of playing with images, of modulating images, which I think mean that Photoshop never announces itself as a radical break or a radical technological rupture. It's one further stage in the set of modulations. So Dalits, along with pretty much everyone else in the village, will still regularly, every 2 or 3 years, take photographs of ancestors to be photoshopped in local studios, to be upgraded, to have their faces cleaned, the colors changed, the backgrounds altered. And Photoshop is achieving what itinerant memorial portraitists used to do. And in Camera Indica, there's quite a long description of one called Nanda Kishore Joshi, who used to travel around this part of, well, used to travel around southern Rajasthan and this part of Malwa, essentially with his paintbrushes, working from photographs, enlarging them, turning them into large frameable images that are suitable for worship in Pitra Paksh protocols. And I think Photoshop almost seamlessly, you know, takes up that work. It's able to do it more quickly, more cheaply, but I don't think in other respects it's fundamentally transforming the ontology of the image. So alongside fluidity, transformational slipperiness, I'd also see a very strong degree of continuity, coherence, and persistence. So I hope that answers some parts of the question. Maybe I could just add that your question also reminds me once that I had an amazing conversation with 2 village Dalits who, to my amazement, suddenly announced that they hadn't been to the cinema for 30 years. And when this is in a environment in which people generally go every few weeks or every couple of months if they can afford it. But these 2 had militantly refused to go to the cinema for 30 years. And it turned out that they'd been present 30 years ago at the filming of a Hindi movie in the local town with Sunny Deol, as I recall. And they'd been watching the fight scenes. And it struck them, and they were amazed by this. It struck them that the fight scenes were all staged. They were completely fake, and they were just outraged by this. They couldn't believe it. They'd spent 20 years going every week to the cinema, and they realized they'd been watching lies. And so anyway, I throw that in as a reminiscence that suggests that the data here is reticulated and bumpy. I'm not sure what to do with that remarkable anecdote. So local ideas are also in some cases underpinned by an extremely strong attachment to notions of authenticity and veracity, and refusing to go to the cinema for 30 years is a sign of how much you privilege that notion of underlying authenticity in the image.
Thank you so much for that, Chris. And thank you, Sumati, for that wonderful question. Maybe we'll take just like 2 more quick questions before we begin to wrap. One of the Zeus Pitawala is asking about like experiences on the field, that I was curious, in your travels and retrieval of photographs, did you face any reservations from local people or local organizations?
No, in general, people are very happy to show, share, and talk about images. I mean, it's a great way of interacting with people. Visual anthropologists often talk about the image as the third interlocutor. So it's often much easier to talk to people in the presence of an image than direct to them without an image. However, I think key to my approach is that I've been going to the same place for 40 years. And, when there aren't pandemics, I've generally been there twice a year for at least 3 months a year. So I suppose since 1982, I've spent about 10 years in more or less in the same place. So people get to know you, they get bored with you, of course, but I think there's a certain amount of, trust. The sufficient evidence of past behavior to form a judgment about, likely future behavior. And, one of the things one could say about those Nag Maharaj images made in 1977, which is 5 years before I first started living intermittently in the village, and in fact living only 3 houses away from the person who owned those photographs. So from 1982 to 2018, those images were unknown to me. So that was an almost 40 years decision on the part of the owner of those images that now was the time to share them. So you could say it says something about the virtues of long-term field work, but I also think it says something about the time that many people quite understandably might take to make a decision about trustworthiness, about what they want to share. So I think, if one's arriving for very brief residence and you give the appearance of being a hit and run ethnographer, I think you're very likely to not get very much at all. So I think, it takes time to mature these relationships. People have to get to know who you are, what you do, what your motivations are. And I suppose my thinking about that's been clarified by working on this recent ERC project, where I was working in Nepal and Bangladesh, among a couple of other places. And so places I'm, in no way familiar with in a similar fashion. but where I had very good research assistants who I don't use in central India. But the mode of work was very different. And yeah, so there, you know, you turn up out of the blue, you're hoping that people might share their most private photographs with you, and of course, understandably, most of the time they have no wish or inclination to do so. I mean, it would take another 10, 20 years of being with them to get to that state, I think.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris. I think we'll take one last question and wrap from Devyani Bhosale. I had a methodological question, she says, regarding your research on Indian popular prints and chromolithographs, the sources for which are difficult to trace. How does one, researching on chromolithographs from an anti-caste perspective, get clarity regarding visual methodologies? What methods did you use in your study of understanding the politics of these prints? Thank you so much for your enlightening talk.
Well, I can't say that I've ever deployed a method specifically relevant to Dalit visuality. So, I mean, the method is a general one, which I would, which I try and apply in all village contexts. So that involves, well, a mixture of participant observation, more structured interviews, conversations. Very often I converge on an image from different perspectives. So, for instance, if one wanted to think about images of Ambedkar in the village context, I've done sufficient work with publishers in Delhi and elsewhere to have a sense of the market for these, the history of the production of those images, the history of the reworking of those images. So, for instance, there's a 1950s Pednekar portrait of Ambedkar that Brij Basi printed, in which he wears a sandy-coloured jacket, not his conventional normative blue suit. And that image was photoshopped and reworked and recently sold very well. Or the other thing that comes to mind is conversations with in Bombay with publishers about images of Shahu Maharaj, the Kolhapur Maharaja, who financed part of Ambedkar's studies. And so from working with publishers, you often get very useful leads about the regional popularity of images, the history of images, all kinds of backstories on those images, some of which one's able to share with village interlocutors who are, of course, very interested to know more of these details. In the case of a figure like Ramdev, so Baba Ramdev Pir, the medieval renouncer king on a horse, who made an appearance in the talk. You know, I think that it involves sitting with that image with many different people across different castes and trying to unpack that narrative. And of course, there are many different slightly contrasting versions of that narrative. So, and doing that feels more or less like conventional ethnography. But I'd say it's a kind of ethnographic art history, more anthropology than art history. So one's talking to live interlocutors, one's greatest sources of information are still living, they have lots to say, and it's usually pretty fascinating.